The night shift at St. Catherine's Medical Center moved the way night shifts always did, slower, softer, stretched thin between exhaustion and routine. Fluorescent lights hummed above polished floors. Monitors blinked in patient rooms like distant city lights. The day staff had gone home hours ago, leaving behind half-finished notes and the faint smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Room 312 was stable. Room 318 needed labs drawn at 2 o'clock. The post-op patient in 305 had finally fallen asleep. The night nurse signed off on a medication chart without hesitation. Her handwriting was small and precise. She did not speak unless necessary. Most of the younger nurses thought she was distant. The charge nurse thought she was dependable. Security barely noticed her at all. She preferred it that way. At 1:17 a.m., she paused at the nurse's station, not because something had happened, but because something had not. The automatic double doors near the ambulance bay had opened twice in the last minute. No stretcher came through. No paramedic voices followed. Just air pressure shifting. She looked down at the admissions board. No inbound trauma. No scheduled transfers. She said nothing. Instead, she walked down the corridor toward the supply room, her steps unhurried. As she passed the ceiling corner near room 309, her eyes flicked upward. The small red indicator light on the security camera was dark. It should have been blinking. Cameras did not fail quietly. They either flickered or triggered alerts. This one was simply off. She stood there for a full second longer than normal, as if adjusting her badge. Then she continued walking. In the supply room, she checked inventory that did not need checking. Her breathing remained even. She counted automatically. Gauze packs, saline bags, tourniquets. Her fingers brushed over a metal tray, and she adjusted its placement by a few inches, aligning it with the edge of the counter. In room 305, the post-op patient stirred. She entered, checked vitals, and offered water. "You're safe," she told him when he asked if he had heard something. Her tone was steady, not comforting, not dismissive, just factual. Safe for now. Back at the nurse's station, a junior nurse was scrolling through her phone. Security said someone was asking about the surgical ward earlier, the junior nurse said casually. Some guy in a jacket. Wouldn't give a name. The night nurse did not react immediately. "What did he want?" she asked. "Said he was looking for a cousin. Didn't know the room number." The night nurse nodded once. Visitors who did not know room numbers were common. Visitors who asked about the surgical ward specifically were not. She logged into the hospital system and scanned the patient list again. One name stood out. A federal transfer admitted under restricted status after a late-night procedure. Guarded earlier in the evening. No guard posted now. Budget cuts, shift rotation delays. She closed the screen. At 1:26 a.m., the overhead lights flickered, just once. A fluctuation most people would blame on the building's aging wiring. She looked toward the end of the hallway. The emergency exit sign near the stairwell glowed steady red. Good. She walked there under the pretense of checking a linen cart. The stairwell door was unlocked as policy required. She opened it slightly and listened. Nothing but the hollow breath of concrete. But there was a smell, faint, metallic, unfamiliar in a hospital corridor that usually carried only antiseptic and plastic. Oil. Gun oil. It was subtle. Most would miss it. She did not. She closed the door softly. When she returned to the nurse's station, she moved the crash cart 2 feet closer to the center of the ward. "In case we get a code," she said when the junior nurse raised an eyebrow. It was a reasonable explanation. She began closing patient doors halfway instead of leaving them fully open. She dimmed the hallway lights 1 notch, citing patient comfort. "We'll come through the main corridor." "She will come through the main corridor," she murmured under her breath, not to him but to herself, mapping angles in her mind. The ward had 2 blind corners, 1 service elevator, and a medication room with reinforced walls. At 1:31 a.m., the sound came. Not a gunshot yet. Something heavier. A metal door forced open somewhere below. The vibration traveled through the floor before the noise reached their ears. The junior nurse froze. Was that... She did not finish the sentence. The night nurse was already moving. Not running. Moving. She pressed the ward intercom and calmly announced, "All staff, initiate internal lockdown protocol for surgical wing." Her voice did not shake. The junior nurse stared at her. "Lockdown? Why?" Another sound answered the question. A distant pop, sharp and unmistakable this time. Not fireworks, not construction. A gunshot. It echoed up the stairwell and rolled down the corridor like thunder trapped indoors. A patient screamed. The junior nurse began to panic. "Call security," she shouted. "Security is already compromised," the night nurse replied quietly. She did not know that for certain, but she calculated it. Cameras offline, unchecked ambulance doors, unidentified visitor, oil in the stairwell, patterns forming. She walked to the main ward entrance and manually engaged the magnetic hold so the doors would close fully instead of remaining partially open. Her hands worked without hesitation. She turned to the junior nurse. "Take rooms 305 and 318. Lock them from inside. Stay low. Do not open unless you hear my voice." "What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air. Another gunshot rang out, closer now. Plaster dust drifted faintly from the ceiling. The night nurse looked down the corridor, measuring distance by sound delay. Her face did not change. "I am going to finish my rounds," she said. It sounded absurd, but there was something in her eyes that stopped further questions. She stepped into room 312 and quietly locked the door behind her. The men moving through the hospital thought they were hunting. They did not know someone had already begun preparing the ground. The night nurse checked the IV line one last time, then turned her head toward the hallway as footsteps began to echo against tile. The second gunshot was not distant. It was inside the building, sharp and immediate, followed by the unmistakable crack of glass breaking somewhere below. The ward lights flickered again, then stabilized. In room 312, the night nurse moved the unconscious patient's bed 2 inches away from the line of sight of the door window. It was a small adjustment, almost invisible, but it changed the angle from the corridor. She shut off the overhead light and left only the monitor glow. Outside, footsteps multiplied, not running, coordinated. She could hear boots on tile, the rhythm controlled, deliberate. A voice barked an order, low, not frantic. These were not desperate men. They had come with a purpose. She stepped into the bathroom attached to the room and checked the ceiling vent. Too narrow, no exit there. She returned to the bed and gently lowered the patient's oxygen flow to reduce the hiss. Sound traveled farther in quiet hallways. Another shot rang out, closer still, followed by a man's shout, and then silence. The junior nurse's muffled sob carried faintly through the wall from room 305. The night nurse pressed her palm briefly against the wall, grounding herself, then crossed back to the door. Through the narrow safety glass, she saw 2 men moving down the corridor in dark clothing, faces partially covered. One carried a compact rifle, the other a handgun. They moved past patient doors without checking inside, scanning room numbers instead, hunting for something specific. She stepped back before their line of sight reached 312. A heavy object slammed into the ward entrance doors. The magnetic hold strained. Another impact. Metal bent. The ward would not hold long. She looked at the patient on the bed. His chart had listed him under restricted federal status. That alone explained the precision downstairs. She leaned close to his ear. "If you wake up, do not speak," she said quietly. He did not move. The third impact on the entrance doors tore one hinge free. The metal screeched, then gave way. Footsteps flooded the corridor. A man shouted, "Check every room from 300 up." They were close now. She unlocked the door of 312, slipped into the hallway, and moved toward the medication room instead of away from the threat. The medication room walls were reinforced for narcotic storage. It would hold longer than any patient room. As she passed the crash cart she had repositioned earlier, she disengaged the brake silently and rolled it halfway across the corridor, angling it near a blind corner. She did not rush. Speed created noise. Precision created advantage. The first attacker reached room 301 and kicked it open. A patient screamed. "Clear!" he called after a glance inside. He was not interested in random victims. That confirmed it. She slipped into the medication room and locked it from the inside. Through the narrow safety window, she watched their reflections in the opposite glass panels as they moved closer. One paused at the nurse's station, flipping through the admissions binder. "Restricted transfer," he muttered to his partner. "Surgical wing, 312. The number echoed in the hallway. She closed her eyes once, then opened them. Timing shifted. She stepped away from the door and moved to the back cabinet where controlled substances were stored. Her hands selected items quickly. Syringes, sedatives, tape. Not weapons. Tools. She placed them into her pocket with deliberate care. Outside, a boot struck the crash cart she had angled earlier. It toppled loudly, metal trays clattering across tile. One of the men cursed. The noise forced them to slow, to reorient. Confusion cost seconds. Seconds mattered. "Room 312!" One shouted again, closer now. She unlocked the medication room just as they passed its doorway and slipped behind them into the dim corridor. Their focus was forward, on the door at the end of the hall, on the number painted beside it. She moved in their shadow, silent, closing distance without drawing attention. When the first attacker reached 312, he tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back to kick it in. In that small shift of balance, she acted. She did not shout. She did not hesitate. She drove the crash cart's metal oxygen tank, previously loosened from its bracket, hard into the back of his knee. The joint collapsed under sudden force. As he fell, she grabbed his wrist, twisting the handgun free before he could fire. The movement was controlled, efficient, without wasted motion. The second attacker spun toward her, rifle lifting, but the corridor was narrow and his partner's falling body blocked his line of sight. She shoved the injured man into him and retreated into the medication room, slamming the reinforced door shut. A bullet struck the metal surface with a deafening clang. Another followed. She dropped to the floor beside the doorframe, breathing steady despite the echoing shots. They were angry now. Angry meant louder, less disciplined. "She's in there!" One shouted. She heard them regrouping outside. One attempted the handle. Locked. "Get something to break it." Footsteps retreated down the corridor. She rose immediately and moved to the back of the medication room, where a secondary service exit led to a narrow supply corridor. Few staff used it. She opened it and slipped through, locking it behind her. The service corridor was dark, lit only by emergency strips along the baseboards. She moved quickly now, but still controlled, counting doors as she passed. 5 steps to the junction, 8 to the maintenance elevator. She did not take the elevator. Elevators trapped people. Instead, she turned toward the rear access that looped back behind room 312. Another gunshot echoed from the main hall. They were firing blindly into the medication door, wasting ammunition. Good. She emerged near the rear wall of 312 and entered through the secondary staff door, locking it immediately. The patient remained unconscious. She exhaled once, then began moving the bed toward the bathroom. If they breached the front entrance, they would expect him center room. She would not give them predictable space. Outside, footsteps pounded back toward 312. A voice shouted, "Doors reinforced." She slipped out. Silence followed, tense and searching. They were adjusting. So was she. She dimmed the last monitor light and positioned herself behind the heavy supply cabinet near the bathroom entrance, the confiscated handgun resting steady in her grip, not raised wildly, aligned. She listened to their breathing through the door. One of them tested the handle again. 312, he said quietly this time. She's protecting him. The night nurse did not respond. She simply waited, calculating angles in the dark, as the first heavy strike hit the door and the wood began to splinter. The first strike cracked the wood near the handle. The second tore the lock plate halfway loose. Dust drifted into the room, pale against the dim light of the heart monitor she had nearly silenced. The night nurse did not fire through the door. Shooting blind wasted ammunition and revealed position. She stepped back 2 measured paces and shifted slightly left, forcing any entry angle to expose a shoulder first, not a weapon. The third impact burst the door inward. It swung violently, slamming against the interior wall. The first attacker entered low and fast, rifle raised. He expected panic. He expected a silhouette near the bed. Instead, he saw an empty center space and a toppled bedside tray, positioned deliberately to disrupt footing. His boot struck it. Not enough to drop him, but enough to break rhythm. In that fraction of imbalance, she moved. She did not charge. She stepped forward, controlled, and drove her forearm hard against the underside of his rifle barrel, redirecting the muzzle toward the ceiling as his finger tightened reflexively. The shot exploded into plaster above them. Before the echo faded, she pivoted inside his reach, seized the sling near his shoulder, and twisted. The motion forced his torso offline and brought his center of gravity forward. She struck once behind his ear with the base of her palm. Precise. The body went heavy. She lowered him instead of letting him crash, guiding him down to reduce noise. The second attacker hesitated in the doorway, startled by the speed of it. He fired twice into the room, bullets shredding drywall. She pulled the fallen man fully inside and kicked the door halfway closed, using his body weight as temporary obstruction. The gunfire paused. The second attacker shifted tactics, stepping back into the corridor to change angle. She dragged the unconscious man toward the bathroom threshold, removed his rifle sling completely, and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, not foreign. She did not keep it. Long guns were liabilities in tight hospital rooms. She set it aside and checked his vest for additional magazines, pocketing one without breaking tempo. Outside, the remaining attacker's breathing had changed. Faster now, less controlled. He tried to re-enter, pushing against the door and his partner's weight. She stepped into the bathroom doorway and spoke for the first time since the breach. "Leave," she said evenly. Not loud, not emotional, just clear. There was a pause. "You don't understand," the man replied from the hall. His voice was tighter now. "We're not here for you." "I know who you're here for," she answered. Silence followed. That silence told her more than words. He had not expected recognition. He shifted again, attempting to fire through the wall toward the bed's original position. The rounds tore into empty mattress. She watched the bullet paths carefully, counting spacing, estimating magazine depletion. When the gunfire stopped to reload, she stepped forward and fired once through the doorframe at knee height. A controlled shot, a deliberate angle. A cry followed, sharp, involuntary. She did not fire again. Instead, she moved quickly, flanked through the secondary staff door, and emerged behind him in the corridor before he recovered. He was kneeling, clutching his leg, weapon dropped beside him. He looked up and saw her in nurse scrubs, hair pulled back, face calm. Confusion crossed his expression before fear replaced it. She kicked the weapon away and pressed him flat against the tile, using leverage rather than strength. Her knee locked his injured leg in place to prevent further resistance. "How many?" she asked quietly. He gritted his teeth, said nothing. She increased pressure slightly. Not enough to break, enough to clarify options. "How many?" she repeated. "3," he gasped. "3 total." That meant one more. Her eyes flicked down the corridor. The ward was eerily silent except for distant alarms. She secured the injured man's wrists with medical restraints from her pocket, tightened them efficiently, then rolled him onto his side to prevent shock from airway obstruction. Even now, she preserved his breathing. Restraint, not vengeance. As she stood, a voice echoed faintly from farther down the corridor. The third man had separated earlier, likely sweeping rooms to prevent interference. She moved toward the nurse's station, keeping to wall shadows. The third attacker emerged from a patient room holding a terrified orderly by the collar, weapon pressed against the man's temple. "Drop it," he shouted when he saw her. His aim was steady. Unlike the others, this one had not lost control. She lowered the handgun slowly, letting it slide across the floor out of reach. The orderly trembled, eyes locked on her, pleading silently. "We leave with him," the attacker said, jerking his chin toward room 312. "Or he dies." She measured distance. 12 feet, clear line. Hostage positioned high. Too much risk for a clean shot. She did not attempt one. Instead, she spoke again, her tone unchanged. "Your exit is compromised," she said. "Police will be here in under 4 minutes." It was an estimate, but a calculated one. Sirens were faintly audible now beyond the building walls. He hesitated, just slightly. She continued, "Your team is down. You are alone." His eyes flicked down the corridor instinctively. In that glance, she moved, not toward him, but toward the light panel on the wall. She slammed her palm against the emergency cut switch. The corridor dropped into partial darkness, illuminated only by red backup strips near the floor. In low light, depth perception shifts. Training adapts. Panic does not. The attacker fired blindly toward where she had stood seconds earlier. She was already moving laterally, silent against the wall, closing angle. She did not rush the gun. She threw a metal clipboard hard against the opposite wall. The sharp clang redirected his aim momentarily. In that split second, she stepped inside his line, grabbed the hostage's shoulder, and yanked him downward while striking the attacker's wrist upward. The gun discharged into the ceiling. She rotated under his extended arm, locking it against her shoulder and applying torques until the weapon fell free. The man tried to recover, but she drove him into the nurse's station counter edge, using structure to multiply force. His breath left him in a single broken exhale. She restrained him with the same clinical efficiency as the second. No extra strikes, no anger. When it was done, the corridor fell quiet except for distant sirens growing louder. The orderly stared at her, shaking. "Who are you?" he whispered. She did not answer. Instead, she picked up the fallen rifle and cleared it safely before setting it aside. From room 312, a weak voice spoke for the first time. The federal transfer had woken. "That movement," he murmured hoarsely from inside the room. "That's not nursing school." She paused in the doorway, but did not turn fully toward him. "Stay still," she said. "You're post-operative." He watched her silhouette in the red emergency glow and studied the way she scanned corners before stepping through thresholds. After a long silence, he said quietly, "Delta?" She adjusted the IV line without looking at him. "You lost blood," she replied calmly. It was not an answer. It did not need to be. Outside, the first wave of law enforcement boots thundered into the building, shouting commands into a ward that was already under control. She stepped back into shadow before they reached her position, her breathing steady again, as if the last 10 minutes had been routine. The sirens grew louder, then steadier, then stopped abruptly outside the emergency entrance. The echo of boots filled the lower levels of the hospital. Commands were shouted, radios crackled. The night nurse did not relax. Noise did not mean resolution. Noise meant variables. She stood in the doorway of room 312, watching the restrained attackers in the corridor, calculating the time it would take armed officers to clear stairwells and reach the surgical wing. The federal transfer on the bed tried to push himself upright and failed, pain cutting across his bandaged torso. His voice was thin but clear. "They won't stop," he said. "If I'm alive, they won't stop." She checked the monitor leads he had pulled loose and reattached them with steady fingers. "You are not moving," she said. "Your sutures will not hold." He looked at her with something close to recognition now, not of her face, but of her restraint. "You could have left," he said quietly. Down the corridor, one of the restrained men shifted, testing the medical bindings. She stepped out, tightened them without speaking, then returned to the room and closed the door halfway. The patient's words lingered. She could leave now. Law enforcement would take over. Her responsibility officially ended at patient stabilization. But she had heard the third attacker on the radio earlier, a clip transmission before the struggle. Backup had been mentioned, not inside the building. Outside perimeter, waiting for confirmation. That meant the threat had not been fully contained. If extraction failed inside, they would adapt. She looked at the window at the far end of the ward. Dark parking lot, multiple vehicles, too many blind spots. A hospital evacuation under active threat would create chaos. Chaos created opportunity for men who planned in advance. She stepped to the wall phone and dialed security command directly, bypassing the general line. "Surgical wing secured internally," she said evenly. "But you have external assets. Check the north parking structure. Level 2. "Who is this?" the voice demanded. She hung up before answering. The patient watched her. "You're staying," he said. It was not a question. She did not respond. Instead, she began disconnecting his IV lines from the wall mounts and transferring them to portable supports. His eyes widened slightly. "I can't walk." "You don't need to," she replied. She unlocked the rear staff door that led into the service corridor. It was narrow, lined with supply racks and old gurneys. Most staff forgot it existed. She began pushing his bed slowly into that corridor, movements controlled to avoid jarring his stitches. Halfway through, her shoulder tightened involuntarily. The earlier struggle had left its mark. She ignored it. Cost could be assessed later. As they moved, distant gunfire erupted outside the building, shorter bursts this time from different calibers. She did not flinch. She turned left at the junction instead of right, taking the longer maintenance route toward radiology. "You're not running," the patient said. She adjusted the portable monitor without looking at him. "No," she answered. She was repositioning. Radiology's imaging rooms were reinforced with lead-lined walls, limited entry points, better defensive position if the external team breached upward. She pushed the bed through a set of double doors and into the CT scan suite, locking it behind her. The room was dim, lit only by standby indicators on the machines. She positioned the bed between two heavy consoles, narrowing approach angles. Then she turned off the remaining lights entirely, leaving the room in controlled darkness. The patient studied her silhouette. "They trained you to think like this," he said softly. She checked his pulse again, slightly elevated but stable. "They trained me to finish what I start," she said. It was the closest she had come to acknowledgement. A sudden crash echoed from the surgical wing direction. Not police. Too sharp. Too isolated. She moved instantly to the CT control window and peered through the narrow glass slit into the hallway beyond radiology. A figure moved at the far end. One more, slower, cautious. The backup asset had entered through an alternate stairwell. He was scanning methodically, weapon tight to shoulder, not panicked like the others. Professional. She felt a familiar shift inside, not fear, but clarity. This one would not make obvious mistakes. The patient followed her gaze. "You can leave me," he said quietly. "Seal the door. Save yourself." For the first time, she looked directly at him. "You were assigned protection," she said. "Budget cuts removed it. That was not your decision." She turned back to the door. "This one is." The footsteps approached radiology. The handle tested lightly. No immediate force. He was listening. She stepped behind the CT gantry and positioned herself low, using the curved machine housing as partial cover. When the door opened slowly, he entered with disciplined caution, sweeping corners with his weapon light. The beam passed inches from where she stood. She did not fire immediately. Shooting in a room filled with complex machinery risked ricochet and catastrophic damage. Instead, she waited until he committed fully inside. When he advanced toward the bed silhouette she had deliberately positioned as bait, she moved behind him silently and shut the heavy radiology door with force, sealing them inside together. He spun, startled by the sound, and their eyes met in the low emergency glow. He saw scrubs. He saw calm. He underestimated for half a second. That half second was enough. She stepped inside his weapon arc and trapped the rifle against the curved CT housing, using the machine's mass to pin the barrel. He resisted hard, stronger than the others. The struggle was tight, controlled, brutal in its efficiency. No wide swings, no wasted motion. He attempted to draw a secondary weapon. She intercepted the movement with her forearm and drove him backward into the imaging console. Her injured shoulder flared with sharp pain. She did not release pressure. Instead of striking repeatedly, she targeted structure, elbow joint, wrist rotation, center balance. When the rifle dropped, she kicked it beneath the machine and forced him face down against the tile, applying controlled torque until resistance broke. She secured him with restraints torn from a radiology cable bundle. He lay breathing hard but conscious. She stepped back, chest rising slightly faster now. The cost registered, shoulder strain, bruised ribs, adrenaline fading. Outside, the sound of officers shouting commands grew closer to radiology. She unlocked the door and raised her empty hands as armed police flooded the corridor. "Suspect restrained," she said simply. An officer stared at the scene. The subdued man, the confiscated rifle, the nurse in scrubs standing between them, and a federal witness hidden behind heavy medical equipment. "Ma'am, step away," he ordered reflexively. She did. Immediately. No argument, no explanation. As they secured the attacker, she turned back to the patient and reconnected his monitor line to the nearest power source. Her movements were slower now. The adrenaline had burned through, leaving only fatigue and the dull ache of impact. The patient watched her carefully. "You stayed," he said again. She adjusted his blanket. "You're stable," she replied. It was the only answer she offered. By the time the sun began to press a thin gray line against the horizon, the hospital had fallen into a controlled quiet that felt heavier than the gunfire had. Tactical teams cleared the last stairwell. Paramedics moved the restrained attackers onto stretchers under armed guard. Broken glass was swept into piles. Bullet casings were photographed, cataloged, sealed in evidence bags. The surgical wing smelled faintly of cordite beneath the antiseptic. The night nurse stood near the nurse's station while a detective took her statement. She answered in short, precise sentences, times, positions, actions taken to protect patients. She did not describe angles or techniques. She did not embellish. When asked how she had managed to subdue multiple armed men, she replied, "They were injured during entry." The detective studied her for a moment longer than necessary, but wrote the statement down without argument. Across the hall, officers escorted the federal transfer past on a gurney toward a secure ambulance. He turned his head despite the pain and found her standing near the medication room door. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a slight nod. Not dramatic, not grateful, just aware. She inclined her head once in return and looked away first. No further acknowledgement passed between them. A senior federal agent entered the ward shortly after, scanning the damage with tight focus. His gaze stopped when he noticed a faint mark near her wrist where her sleeve had shifted during the struggle. It was not a full tattoo visible, only the edge of old ink, a geometric fragment that meant nothing to most people. To him, it meant something else entirely. Recognition flickered across his face, subtle and quickly suppressed. He approached her without uniformed officers nearby. "You were on shift all night?" he asked evenly. "Yes," she answered. "You should get that shoulder looked at," he said quietly, his eyes dropping to the slight stiffness in her posture. "It's fine," she replied. A pause hung between them. He considered asking the question directly. Instead, he adjusted his tie and said, "We will handle the rest." She nodded once. "The radiology room will need inspection," she said. "There is structural damage near the console." He gave the faintest exhale of something close to understanding. "Of course." He did not press further. Outside, the sky lightened from gray to pale blue. Day shift staff began arriving, stepping carefully around police tape with wide eyes and whispered questions. Rumors had already begun to spread. Some said security had stopped the attackers. Others believed the gunmen had fought each other. The junior nurse from earlier approached her slowly, still shaken. "I heard you were with them," she said softly. "In the hallway." The night nurse handed her a clipboard with updated patient notes. "Vitals for 305 need to be rechecked," she said. The junior nurse swallowed and nodded, accepting the task without further inquiry. The ward needed order restored. That was the priority. An ambulance door slammed outside. Engines started. The last of the suspects were transported away. Maintenance crews replaced shattered door frames. A new security detail took positions at entrances. The noise gradually faded into the rhythm of a hospital returning to function. In room 312, now empty, sunlight fell across the repaired bed frame. The night nurse entered alone for a moment and adjusted the curtains back to their original alignment. She picked up a fallen medical chart from the floor and smoothed its pages flat. There was dried blood near the threshold. Not much, but enough to mark what had happened. She cleaned it herself rather than calling environmental services. When she finished, she removed her gloves and disposed of them carefully. At 7:02 a.m., she signed the shift report and placed it neatly on the counter for the incoming nurse. Her shoulder ached more now that the adrenaline had fully drained away. She rotated it once, testing the range. Limited, but functional. A security officer approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, command wanted to know if you needed an escort home." She shook her head. "No." He nodded, unsure whether to salute or simply step aside. He chose the latter. As she walked toward the staff exit, the federal agent from earlier watched from the far end of the corridor. He did not call out to her. He did not offer thanks. Instead, he placed a brief call on his secure phone. "Transfer secured," he said. A pause. "Yes, she's still in country." Another pause. "Understood." He ended the call before she reached the door. The night air had cooled just before dawn, carrying the faint smell of rain. She stepped into the parking lot and paused only long enough to glance once at the upper floors of the hospital. Lights still glowed in several rooms. Patients still needed monitoring. Life continued. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her uninjured shoulder and began walking toward her car. No reporters waited. No officers followed. Inside the building, discussions would continue for days about how the surgical wing had held. Reports would circulate. Questions would be asked quietly in rooms without windows, but by the time the sun fully rose above the city, she was already driving home, her scrubs still faintly marked with dust, her expression unchanged. When she returned that evening for another shift, her name would still appear on the schedule under night nurse. No additional title, no decoration. The ward would hum as it always did, and most of the people walking those corridors would never know how close the night had come to breaking.